A study found that 80 to 95% of college students procrastinate. If this sounds like you, then you've come to the right place because today we'll go over 4 powerful anti-procrastination tips. Tip number 1, learn to accept failure. Behavioral psychologists J.R. Ferrari and D.M. Tice conducted a study in 2000 at DePaul University. They gathered a bunch of students who identified as chronic procrastinators and instructed them to solve some math puzzles. They separated the participants into 2 groups, a serious one and a fun one. The serious group was told that the puzzle would be used as a test to gauge their abilities, while the fun group was told that the puzzle was meaningless. Both groups were then given free time along with some games, but also some material that could be used to prepare for the math puzzle. What happened next was very interesting. The serious group spent the majority of their free time playing around with the games, spending very little to no time preparing, while the fun group spent the majority of their time preparing. The study concluded that procrastinators often sabotage themselves when faced with tasks which they could fail. You see, if the participants in the serious group tried hard and failed to solve the puzzle, they would be hit with a wave of negative emotions. It would suggest that they were dumb or incompetent. On the other hand, for the fun group, the puzzle was meaningless, so there was nothing to fail at. Not being able to solve the puzzle would not have any negative implications. And because there was no possibility for negative emotions, they did not feel the need to procrastinate. Ferrari explained that chronic procrastinators would rather have other people think they lack effort than lack ability. In other words, they would prefer to be thought of as lazy than as a failure. How can we apply this to our lives? Well, if we can reframe how we look at failure, if we can look at it as an opportunity to grow and learn, as compared to it being proof that we are losers who will never amount to anything, then we should feel less of a need to avoid the work in the first place. Alternatively, we could take things less seriously and realize that failure in a test or a project doesn't really mean anything in the grand scheme of things. Of course, this is easier said than done, but it is something to think about. Moving on to tip number 2, increasing your self-compassion. A study was conducted in 2010 by Michael Wohl and Dr. Pitchell. They interviewed 119 students before 2 major tests. The researchers found that students who forgave themselves for procrastinating on the first test were much less likely to procrastinate on the second test. Another study conducted in 2012 found that procrastinators tended to have higher stress and lower levels of self-compassion. Both of these studies suggest that self-compassion reduces the amount of negative emotions that students feel, which, as we know from tip number 1, is a major reason why many of us procrastinate in the first place. When you are quick to forgive yourself for making mistakes, you are less likely to spend long periods of time waist deep in negative emotions. You quickly brush the mistake off and move on with your life. Now, how exactly do we increase our self-compassion? Well, for one, a large part of self-compassion can come from the belief that no one is perfect. We are all flawed beings, and that's okay. That's just how things are. Instead of beating yourself up for making a mistake, simply make a note of it, think about what you can do next time to avoid messing up, and move on. An alternative strategy that can be used to increase your self-compassion is to write down a list of positive things about yourself, or things that you've done every week or so. As cheesy as it sounds, it can work because it forces you to look at yourself in a positive light. Also, you should spend less time on social media. Influencers often pretend that they live picture-perfect lives. When we see this, we start to believe that this lifestyle is far more common than it actually is, which makes us feel worse about ourselves and the current situation that we are in. I suggest avoiding social media as much as possible and primarily using it for either communication with friends or business. If you are struggling with feelings of self-worth and self-compassion, it is always a good idea to speak with a therapist. Moving on to tip number 3. The adoption of the smartphone has made it easy for us to stack multiple stimulating activities on top of each other. You can now play a video game while listening to a podcast and eat junk food all at the same time. Each of these activities on their own releases a large amount of dopamine, but when you combine the 3, you end up releasing much more. Exposure to high levels of dopamine for long periods of time lowers your baseline level of dopamine. It's almost like your body starts to build an immunity to it, and you'll find it harder to feel excited for the simpler things in life, including doing the work you know you need to do. Which is why tip number 3 is to avoid dopamine stacking. Try your best to avoid doing multiple stimulating activities at the same time. The next time you have a meal, try to enjoy the meal instead of pulling out your phone and watching YouTube. The next time you watch a show, put away your phone and just focus on the show in front of you. You get the idea. By doing this, you will gradually increase your baseline levels of dopamine over time. This may be hard at first, you might feel bored if you're not stacking, but over time it will get easier as your baseline levels of dopamine recover and things start to feel less boring. You could also try a dopamine fast, where you stay away from all overstimulating activities for a day. Doing so can speed up the recovery. If you'd like to learn more about dopamine fast, you can check out a video I did on the subject in the description box below. And finally, we have tip number 4, trick yourself. This is a psychological trick that we sourced from Dr. Tim Pitchell, a psychologist and expert on procrastination. Here's how it works. When you start a task, think about the next step as something that you may or may not do. You can tell yourself, I won't do that, but if I did, how would I do it? So for example, let's say you have to pack a suitcase, but you've been putting it off. You could trick yourself by thinking, okay, I'm not going to pack the bag, but if I did, what would my first step be? Maybe it's to find the suitcase and open it up. If so, where is that suitcase right now? By thinking about the path of execution, you will have essentially tricked yourself to start. And motivation tends to follow action. So once you get started, you'll find it much easier to get the ball rolling and finish the rest of the task. Fighting procrastination is important, but being smart with your time is even more important, which is why one of the best things to consider is if school is even worth your time, as there are many other options out there. This is why I suggest you check out our video on the top 3 remote careers that are currently in high demand. You can find it in the description box below. These are all careers that are high paying, where you can get hired in under 6 months. Hope this video was helpful. Besides that, stay tuned.